but happy Friday, everyone. My name is Hannah. I am a media officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on the report that was released earlier this week, Progress Towards Restoring the Everglades, the 10th Biennial Review. You can download a copy of the report and other supporting materials at www.nap.edu. A recording of this webinar will be available on the National Academies website later this week. For those of you not familiar with the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we are private, nonprofit institutions that provide independent, objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, engineering, and medicine. For each requested study, panel members are chosen for their expertise and experience and serve pro bono to carry out the study's statement of task. The reports that result from the study represent the consensus view of the committee and must undergo external peer review before they are released, as did this report. We have several committee members with us here today to discuss the report, but before I turn it over to them, I want to go over a few reminders. Please note that this webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour. We'll start off with a presentation summarizing the report by the committee, and then we'll open it up to any questions you may have. To ask a question, simply click Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. You can submit a question at any time during the presentation, and we'll work to get to as many as we can at the end. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jim Sayers, the Clifton R. Musser Professor of Hydrology at the Yale School of the Environment and chair of the committee that wrote the report. Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Hannah. Good afternoon. I'm here also with Stephanie Johnson, who is the study director. I'm also joined by 3 other members of our committee, Helen Regan, Jeff Walters, and Dave Wagner. I'll begin with about a 25-minute presentation, then we'll open it up to you for questions. In 2000, Congress authorized the Comprehensive Restoration Plan, or CERP. It's a joint federal and state program intended to get the water right by restoring its quantity, quality, timing, and distribution while providing for water supply and flood protection. Originally envisioned as a 30-year effort, CERP involved 68 individual project components, including water storage reservoirs, constructed wetlands, seepage management, and removal of barriers to sheet flow. CERP's current costs are estimated at $23 billion, about 3 times more than was originally projected. With the initial authorization of CERP, Congress recommended that an independent scientific review of restoration progress be conducted on a regular basis. The National Academies formed the Committee on Independent Scientific Review of Everglades Restoration Progress, or CERP. This is the committee's 10th report. It provides an update on progress towards natural system restoration, describes substantive accomplishments, evaluates scientific issues that may impact restoration progress, and considers monitoring protocols that are used to assess CERP progress. The CERP committee is 15 strong and is comprised of natural scientists, social scientists, and engineers specializing in ecosystem restoration, water resources, climate change, and environmental policy and management. Some members have been on this committee for several cycles, while others are more recent additions. All members have expertise that touches on some aspect relevant to Everglades restoration. Over a 12-month period, our committee met in person or virtually for 11 information gathering sessions, and we heard presentations or received comments from over 80 individuals from state and federal agencies, the tribes, non-governmental organizations, and the public. The committee also learned a great deal during field trips to the Western Everglades and on numerous stops along Tamiami Trail. The synthesis of this information gathered by the committee culminated in a draft report that was then peer-reviewed. The report in its final form represents the consensus views of the committee. This report, like others before it, reviews restoration progress, focusing on what has happened during the past 2 years. According to its statement of task, the committee also identified issues for in-depth evaluation, stemming from new CERP program developments and new information that has implications for restoration progress. For the 2024 report, the committee evaluated the application of indigenous knowledge, application of tools for understanding climate change, and application of adaptive management and incorporation of new information in the CERP. Next, I'll take several minutes to describe some highlights of recent restoration progress. The very good news is that the pace of restoration implementation has reached historic levels, thanks in part to record state and federal investments in fiscal years 2022 and 2023. 6 CERP projects, shown by the green circles on the map, are under construction. These are Picayune Strand, the C-43 Reservoir, Indian River Lagoon South, Biscayne Bay Coastal Wetlands, Broward County Water Preserve Areas, and the Central Everglades Planning Project. The blue circles on the map show 3 projects or project components that have been completed. These are Melaleuca Eradication, CERP New Water, and the C-44 Reservoir. Moreover, the C-111 Spreader Canal, located in the southernmost part of the map, is essentially complete. While construction is moving ahead, information on natural system restoration progress relative to expectations and project objectives remains difficult to find and interpret. It appears that CERP lacks a mechanism for centralized reporting of project-level restoration outcomes. The committee recommends increased attention be given to multi-agency data synthesis and interpretation to support assessment and to improve transparency of restorations to the public and to Congress. While there is room for improvement in reporting on project-level outcomes, benefits from completed or nearly completed projects are beginning to accrue. The recent completion of CERP New Water is a restoration milestone, and it is already evident that the combined effects of recently constructed seepage barriers will greatly reduce flood control constraints imposed by the 8.5 square mile area. The map at the right shows the 8.5 square mile area in light blue and the locations of monitoring wells, including Angel's Well, which is installed in the marsh outside the 8.5 square mile area, and well LPG2, which is located just inside the seepage barrier. Since the start of construction of the new water seepage barrier in 2022, water levels in well LPG2, represented in the graph by the black line, have been up to 3 feet lower than water levels in Angel's Well, represented by the red line in the graph. This differential in water levels demonstrates the effectiveness of the seepage barrier in satisfying the sometimes competing demands of community flood protection and hydrological restoration of the adjacent marsh. In Picayune Strand, restoration of hydrology appears to be generating new benefits to the local flora and fauna, with both vegetation and macroinvertebrates communities responding favorably. Moreover, CERP investments in invasive species control have contributed to a 75% reduction in the area dominated by Melaleuca, and have largely controlled air potato reproduction to the extent that air potato is no longer a priority invasive species. The Combined Operations Plan is another success story. Initial monitoring results indicate that the COP is generally meeting expectations in achieving hydrological and ecological restoration objectives. As illustrated by the bar graph, COP has been remarkably successful in increasing water deliveries across Tamiami Trail, particularly during the dry season, and in restoring the historical distribution of those flows between western and northeastern Shark River Slough. The rehydration of Northeast Shark River Slough represents the largest step yet towards restoring the hydrology and ecology of the Central Everglades. It seems, though, that changes caused by COP have resulted in some issues with water quality and have caused anticipated adverse effects on the Cape seaside sparrow. These issues will require some creative solutions. There are several projects in the planning pipeline as well. These include WERP, the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project, and the Biscayne Bay Southeastern Ecosystem Restoration Project. WERP is one of the few CERP projects that address ecological degradation in the Western Everglades. The planning process has been lengthy and challenging, but if implemented as planned, WERP is expected to improve hydrology, water quality, and ecological connectivity over a large 12,000 square mile region of the Western Everglades shown in the figure. Of course, it's never easy. Implementation progress will depend in part on non-CERP source control measures for phosphorus that must be enacted by private landowners. Regarding water quality issues, the South Florida Water Management District has made important strides in improving stormwater treatment area performance. Total phosphorus concentrations in stormwater treatment area 3 and 4 are already meeting the water quality-based effluent limit, or WQ-BEL. And outflow concentrations in the other STAs are declining towards regulatory standards. Attainment of the WQ-BEL at STAs along the eastern and western flow paths will ultimately depend on how they respond to recent restoration strategies actions, in addition to vigilant management of soil and vegetation within the treatment areas. Regarding water quality in the marshes south of the STAs, the committee recommends additional research to explore biogeochemical effects from CERP. It has been observed that increases in flow rates, changes in canal to marsh interactions, and other factors that accompany restoration may mobilize legacy phosphorus. For example, total phosphorus loading to Everglades National Park, as shown by the gray bars in the graph, have increased over recent years. The committee recommends research to elucidate mechanisms that underpin these phenomena to inform approaches to mitigate phosphorus impacts. The third chapter of the CERP report focuses on indigenous knowledge and CERP. In 2021, the Executive Office of the President released a memorandum on indigenous knowledge and its role in federal decision-making, and subsequently issued guidance to federal agencies on considering and including and applying indigenous knowledge. Based on specific suggestions from the agency, the committee examined the application of IK in the CERP and opportunities to improve its inclusion for the purposes of enhancing restoration progress. In preparation for writing the report, the committee reached out to the tribes to learn about their perspectives, and we appreciate the tribes' helpful input. Broadly speaking, indigenous knowledge refers to the body of knowledge generated by indigenous peoples about their environment and relationships between people and that environment. IK is continuously accrued over longer timescales than knowledge generated from modern Western science. It is typically based on frequent observations and interactions, which contrasts with periodic observations made in many Western scientific studies. In numerous cases, indigenous knowledge has proven to be highly effective in enabling detection of deviations from baseline conditions that occur within ecosystems over short and long timescales. Thus, IK and Western science can provide complementary insights, like the way that different disciplines offer unique expertise, methods, and perspectives to solving complex problems. Realizing the potential of indigenous knowledge relies on consistent, meaningful engagement between CERP agencies and the tribes. It's noteworthy that current representatives of the Corps, the district, and the Miccosukee tribe expressed a growing culture of coordination between the agencies and the tribes. This is illustrated by the application of indigenous knowledge to inform decision-making in work and to affect operational changes of the S12A and S12B structures, shown here at the right, to mitigate flooding of tree islands and water conservation area 3A during a period of heavy rainfall in 2023. The committee believes there are many other spaces to engage around application of indigenous knowledge that will advance the goals of both CERP and the tribes. For instance, given the connection of the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes to tree islands and the wealth of knowledge the tribes have accumulated over generations, the development of one or more CERP tree islands performance measures is a prime opportunity to better incorporate IK into the CERP process. Within the vein of meaningful engagement, the committee recommends that RECOVER and other CERP staff implement best practices in their efforts to engage the tribe. These best practices include to involve tribal members in planning, research, and monitoring efforts with funding where necessary, to foster co-stewardship and co-production of knowledge to support restoration and priorities that are of value to the tribes, to encourage participation by tribal members in planning meeting agendas, to provide opportunities for the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes to share knowledge in culturally sensitive ways, and to create data sharing agreements that center on Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. To continue to improve the quality of tribal engagement, the committee recommends training should be developed in consultation with the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes and be required for all agency staff who interact with tribal members. The committee also recommends actions to ensure that opportunities for collaboration are not lost because of staffing resource constraints. With the accelerating pace of restoration, demands on the personnel of CERP agencies and the tribal nations will certainly grow. CERP agencies can improve their capacity through increased staffing to ensure a breadth of expertise and uninterrupted relations in the event of personnel turnover. To increase tribal staff availability for consultation and engagement, grants to the tribe should be considered, as has been done with other restoration programs. The committee recognized the peer review process recently developed by the Miccosukee as an excellent example of a mechanism for enhancing consideration of Indigenous knowledge in Everglades restoration. This process results from an extensive effort by the Miccosukee tribe to speak to Western scientific norms on data quality and transparency in culturally appropriate ways. The onus is now upon the agencies to meet the tribes where they are and to develop protocols that effectively consider and apply IK, even when it does not conform perfectly to Western scientific norms and presentation. In several past reports, CERP has examined restoration planning in the context of climate change. We addressed this issue again in the 10th biennial report with a focus on application of tools to evaluate the effects of climate change. The committee recognizes that attempting to include climate change information in CERP is a formidable task. The amount of climate change information, the uncertainty of this information, and the complications of incorporating climate information in CERP models are legitimate challenges. The committee recommends that a strategy to understand the impacts of climate change should be developed with a curated set of climate scenarios. These scenarios should represent the range of possible changes in precipitation, temperature, and sea level rise that reflect the review of the scientific literature and available climate projections. These planning scenarios should be applied through existing CERP hydrologic and ecological models to provide insights on the potential vulnerability of flora, fauna, and infrastructure to plausible climate-related changes. The committee went on to consider opportunities to incorporate climate information into modeling tools used for planning and assessment. Survival of coastal wetlands will partly depend on the ability of coastal mangrove and sawgrass habitats, such as those shown on the right, to accrete sediments vertically. And hence, models for sediment accretion are being used in CERP planning to understand the potential outcomes of restoration alternatives. These models, however, are largely conceptual in nature and poorly constrained by observations linking accretion rates to underlying drivers. The committee recommends applying dynamic sediment accretion models and to leveraging new and existing observations to lower uncertainty in relations between accretion rates, salinity, and inundation to increase the confidence in the ecological benefits of large-scale coastal restoration projects. The committee also concludes that because wildlife species are key indicators of Everglades restoration success, existing ecological models should be used to a greater extent and further developed to anticipate the effects of climate change, including temperature. The committee also calls for more cohesive integration of ecological and physical models to better understand the effects of climate change on restoration outcomes. The last chapter of the CERP 10 report addresses adaptive management, as well as the use of new information in decision-making. When the US Congress approved CERP in the Water Resources Development Act of 2000, the Central and South Florida Comprehensive Review was recognized as providing a general outline for restoration, rather than a detailed restoration plan. In consideration of the Congress's direction to move forward in the face of uncertainty, adaptive management was identified as a mechanism to incorporate emerging scientific information into the plan. Congress subsequently approved funding for an adaptive management and monitoring program in WRDA 2000 and directed the Corps to adopt an adaptive management approach. In Chapter 5 of the report, the committee evaluates CERP agencies' use of new information for monitoring, modeling, and research to inform decision-making at 4 different stages. These stages are project-level adaptation during design and construction, project-level adaptive management after operations begin, adaptation of operations themselves, and program-level adaptive management. The committee finds that CERP has thorough guidance for adaptive management at the project level, but the process can be time-consuming and burdensome. There have been adaptive management success stories, such as in the Picayune Strand, where modifications were made to accommodate the needs of endangered species, and in CEP North, with modifications to the design of constructed tree islands along the Miami Canal. But for other projects and project components, such as the Deering Estates in Biscayne Bay coastal wetlands, the time required to translate new information to requisite modifications to operations or design has been protracted. As more projects come online, it will become increasingly important to streamline processes to enable faster responses to information. The committee finds that adaptation to operations to new information is a strength of water management for restoration. Adaptive approaches have been used effectively to improve operational flexibility, in large part because of regular and transparent communication between scientists and decision makers. Regional systems operation manuals, such as the Lake Okeechobee Systems Operation Manual and the COP, rely on conditions-based observations to provide maximum flexibility and responsiveness to changing conditions. The committee recommends broadening the use of conditions-based operations where appropriate. At least to the knowledge of the committee, program-level adaptive management has not been implemented in detail. In 2015, Recover identified program-level mission-critical uncertainties, including the implications of climate change and available water storage on restoration outcomes. But no coordinated program-level adaptive management strategy has been implemented. The committee agrees that the potential for learning through the anticipated second periodic CERP update is substantial and should support renewed attention to program-level adaptive management. The committee identified areas where additional consideration could be given to improve adaptive management in CERP. First, building an expertise in and a culture of adaptive management should be made a priority. Second, greater consideration should be given to strengthening a science enterprise to support adaptive management. This enterprise should enable the integration of monitoring, modeling, synthesis, and indigenous knowledge. Third, communication of restoration performance should be improved. Effective adaptive management relies on the timely sharing of data and knowledge, both within and across projects. Multi-agency reporting on project outcomes, such as a CERP dashboard built on key metrics that are collectively developed, would improve tracking of project outcomes and communication to management and the public. All these efforts will require strong direction from Corps and district leadership that adaptive management is a CERP priority that adds value and improves the likelihood of restoration success. Such communication should include not only messaging, but also provision of resources for adaptive management implementation, including staffing, to support the rapid increase in the number of CERP projects. The committee also recommends that the Corps headquarters review approval processes associated with incorporating new information into design, construction, and project level adaptive management processes. The Corps has used the 3x3x3 approach in the project planning process to reduce the time associated with review and decision making. The committee encourages Corps headquarters to identify lessons learned from this approach that could be applied to project level adaptive management and the incorporation of new information. By reviewing when decisions must be elevated to the district, division, or headquarters, the Corps can evaluate whether the time and resources needed to gain approval for actions is appropriate to the risks posed, including those associated with further ecosystem degradation stemming from lengthy delays. This evaluation of process and procedures should benefit other Corps projects in addition to CERP. To summarize, over the past 2 years, Everglades restoration has proceeded at a remarkable pace, owing in part to record funding. Moreover, early benefits are becoming evident. The committee believes restoration outcomes can be further enhanced by implementing best practices for considering and applying Indigenous knowledge, through more deliberate application of climate change information and tools, and by improving adaptive management processes for incorporating new information. Success in these regards will rely on new investment of CERP resources, a more robust science enterprise, and leadership to build agency resources that support these objectives. The full report is now available at www.nap.edu. And we will replay this entire process, kicking off the 11th biennial review this fall. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Now we're going to move into the Q&A section of our webinar. So if the committee members who are with us here in the virtual room can turn on their cameras and join us, that would be fantastic. Thank you, Jim, for getting us started with that great overview of the report. And for our attendees, a reminder that you can ask questions using the Q&A function. So we'd love to hear from you and make sure we can use this time to answer as many as we can. So to get us started, our first question is, given the increasing projections of impacts from sea level rise to South Florida and the Everglades, are the projects being reevaluated with respect to this more recent data? It seems that significant impacts to the water levels and flow in the Everglades over the next decade or two could make some of this work and the expenditures unwise. Does anybody want to take a first crack at that one?
I'll start that. Maybe Helen can follow up if she wants, and Stephanie. The committee is recommending that the effects of climate change take a more front and center role, including the effects of sea level rise in ongoing planning projects. And the Biscayne Bay Southeastern Ecosystem Restoration Project is a good example of that. And this precisely for the reasons that this audience member suggests, in that we need to evaluate sort of the vulnerability of infrastructure and sort of the success of planned projects and ecosystem outcomes in light of sort of the challenges associated with changes not only in sea level, but also changes in rainfall and temperature.
So, and I'll jump in. In past reports, the committee has emphasized this need to relook at the whole system in light of new information gained in climate change. And currently, Jim mentioned the periodic CERP update is underway. but we didn't have the results of that. So that's something that we expect to look at carefully in the next report.
Thank you. Yeah, this project is so unique in how we have been able to build reports on reports over the last 20 years. So it's really special to be here with the 10th one. Our next question is about STAs. So STAs are one of the signature features of Everglades restoration. Could you all offer a reflection on their evolution and success?
Yeah, I'll address that. So, you know, the STAs, in many respects, are working remarkably well in that they are removing large volume or large percentage of incoming phosphorus levels. Some of the STAs are meeting sort of regulatory goals. Some of them, especially along the eastern and western flow paths, aren't. Their trajectories improving, and there's been several recent changes in through restoration strategies to improve their performance. And so the results are encouraging, but in those eastern and western flow paths, those SDAs still have a way to meet their goals. And it's not necessarily that the STAs are performing poorly, but there's challenges associated with very high influent loads of phosphorus into them. And so while they might be removing 70 or 80% of the incoming phosphorus, because the inflows are high and because the outflows must be so exceedingly low, it's a big challenge.
And I'll just add that this committee's report really just had like one additional year of data to look at for the STAs. And so the focus in this report was not too deep of a dive, but it was recognizing the improvements that are underway. The committee's last report, the 2022 biennial review, includes a chapter level assessment of just the significant challenges involved in reaching the water quality based effluent limit. But this recent report does highlight that they are making strides towards that goal.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Stephanie. Our next question asks about some things happening kind of outside of the public lands or on the projects, and it talks about how Indigenous knowledge emphasizes interconnectedness of the entire system, but how there is development on private lands within the ecosystem. And this audience member is asking to what extent the committee analyzes current and anticipated impacts from those development projects.
I can start with an answer to that. So in this report, we did not explicitly look at housing development and its indirect or direct effects on restoration. However, in the climate change chapter of the report, we do emphasize the development and application of integrated modeling frameworks to assess trade-offs between different threats to the system, different processes in the system, and different project goals across the system.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Our next question is related to those climate change recommendations. So you've recommended work on like how to integrate climate change into these projects in your past reports. What's new in this report or different about your climate change recommendation compared to some of the past recommendations about integrating climate change modeling?
Ellen, I will start, and then maybe you can pick up on some of the recommendations related to sort of ecological modeling. Does that sound all right? So in this report, we acknowledge that the sort of dealing with climate change, making projections that reflect climate change are challenging, in part because of uncertainty in climate projections. And so one of the ways that we propose to address that is that the future is uncertain, but even though the future is uncertain, we can't sort of avoid considering it. So what we're suggesting is sort of that CERP agencies develop, or modelers develop, a range of climate scenarios that reflect the range of likely outcomes, or reasonably likely outcomes. And then they use that information as input into both hydrologic models and ecological models. And so we sort of at least have a range on plausible trajectories and stresses caused by rising sea level, perhaps more intense rainfall, and increasing temperatures.
Yeah, thanks. And another new thing that we recommend in this report that I believe has not been highlighted in previous reports is to incorporate information about the effects of temperature on organisms in the Everglades. So some of the ecological endpoints in the system. We know that the temperature projections are more certain and less variable than precipitation. And so we have recommended that in addition to the effects of hydrology on ecological endpoints, so there's a whole host of ecological models that incorporate changes in hydrology, that modelers and planners start considering the effects of temperature on organisms, because these can be quite profound, and overlooking them might lead to just completely not meeting restoration goals in the context of biota in the system. We also recommend, as I said in the response to an earlier question, we also recommend a more comprehensive and systematic integration of ecological models with a curated set of climate change scenarios. So can get, I don't like this term holistic, I guess, a more, comprehensive view of changes across the system, and that will be hard, but we think that there is a lot of merit and utility in at least considering that. And then one extra thing, so there's a lot of new information learning techniques out there that are gaining an enormous amount of traction with these enormous data sets. And so we also think it's worthwhile taking a look at some of these methods to try and extract some signals out of these very large data sets that exist in the Florida Everglades.
And just one other addition, I mentioned it in the presentation, but we also, the committee also draws attention to the need to improve models for sediment accretion, because the survival of the coastal systems and the success of coastal restoration projects is going to reflect in part the ability of these coastal areas to accrete sediments. And so we have to have a better understanding, better data to underpin models to allow us to make future projections on how sediment accretion will occur in the midst of sea level rise.
And Jim, if I can just add to a little bit to what you and Helen just said, I think one thing that's unique to me as being one of the new members on the committee panel was that this report attempts to really tie together not only the climate change, but also the indigenous knowledge and the adaptive management programs, along with lessons learned, et cetera. And Jim hit it when he talked through his summary, in that we believe as a committee that it's important to maintain a very robust science enterprise so that you're gathering that data through monitoring to be able to assess where changes are occurring and perhaps driven by climate change. It's important to have the models that Helen just referred to and Jim just referred to be able to predict what potential impacts may be. It's important to have the research so that if there are gaps that we're identifying associated with climate change, such as sediment accretion, et cetera, that we have the tools to be able to get out there and gather that information. And lastly, and Helen really hit this well, is it's so important that we now include the indigenous knowledge, people who have been on the landscape a whole lot longer than we have, who can help us identify where these changes are occurring. And I think that's one of the things that's new about in this report, is that Stephanie has guided us to really connect the dots, so to speak.
Thank you all. So exciting to see this 10th report, so many years of knowledge all building on each other. Our next question comes from the audience, and it says, you noted the progress being made with the funding and completion of one project and construction underway for another half dozen. But there was a chart in the presentation that shows that many projects are behind by 10 or 20 years or more. Has the committee looked at what has been lost by these delays?
The committee hasn't looked at that specifically. It's an interesting question. Through the several of the original cycles, early cycles of this committee, the committee didn't have much to write about in terms of restoration progress, in part because there were funding constraints. And so we haven't, in this report, we haven't really looked backwards on sort of missed opportunities. But at the same time, we think that it's important to recognize that the forward trajectory over the last several years, and actually in the near term future, in terms of continued restoration implementation is pretty encouraging.
And I'll add in that I think most CERP planners would say that the early scheduling was perhaps overly ambitious. So we don't exactly hold them to those deadlines. The early schedules would say that a project would be done in March of 2021 or something from 2000. But we certainly addressed that issue as well in the adaptive management side, because as more and more projects come into play, there's still new information evolving. There's a need to get that information quickly and be able to, as is possible, adapt those projects, maybe the operations, to be more effective. And yet there's a lot of burdens in the process to implement those changes, get those changes approved. And there is a risk involved in those delays there. And sometimes there's a risk in just the timeline, because right now the projects are going forward so quickly that, if you can't get that information in soon enough, you may lose your opportunity to make that change when it's most cost effective. And so it is important to think about those delays and opportunity costs when you think about these implementation.
Anything to add? I saw you unmute yourself, but maybe that was it.
Yes, I just wanted to say that and Jim alluded to this, in some past reports, we wrote a lot about the consequences of delays before projects were really coming online, and especially in the central Everglades. And now I would say we're in a phase where with projects online, we're starting to see some of those trends reversed, and we're focusing more on that. And of course, there are some surprises that come. Everything doesn't always work out exactly as expected. And that's where adaptive management comes in, trying to adjust to surprises and unforeseen consequences of restoring different parts of the Everglades.
Good stuff. Our next question is from the audience, and it talks about how Everglades restoration benefits are dependent on meeting water quality limits in all of the STAs. But as you noted, only one of the STAs is meeting the QBEL guidance. Do you have guidance for the South Florida Water Management District as they work to meet these deadlines?
In this report, we were a little less prescriptive about guidance than in the previous report. We had made some recommendations for additional research to improve our understanding of phosphorus cycling, some cell-by-cell analyses of cell-by-cell monitoring, and also possible best management practices to reduce loading. I don't know if Stephanie, you want to add on to that, especially with regard to the previous report.
Yeah, I just pulled open my copy so I could take a look. So as I mentioned earlier, we took a deep dive in the last report, so that's where you'll find really the recommendations. And as Jim said, it was mostly about a rigorous science and adaptive management program. We know there is a lot of science underway, but the need to kind of get this right as soon as possible requires learning as much as possible about the operations and adaptations to changes as they're made. And these are very complicated systems, and a lot of work is underway. So yes, there were recommendations in addition to the cell-by-cell monitoring, understanding of hydraulics and how the water loading affects the operations. And there was interest in other issues such as other nutrient dynamics like nitrogen. But you can find those in the last report.
Thanks, Stephanie. Always nice to have that report right in front of you, ready to go. Our next question is about incorporating future climate change impacts by laying out a range of possible scenarios. With those scenarios, are current climate change models sufficient, or does the committee see a need to develop new downscaled products that don't exist yet?
I don't think we know the answer to that question. I had wondered if somebody would ask that question actually across all these meetings we've been having. So we don't know the answer to that. And in part because there is an issue of resolution. Different models might require different resolutions of data. There's also for some of the ecological models, for instance, there's a piecing together of different hydrological models across the landscape. And so, and that's, I believe, relatively recent. And so I don't know how that sort of integrates with downscaled climate data. But, one of our recommendations is for there to be developed a curated set. And so part of that recommendation is for the modelers to have a look at all of the components that need to be incorporated into an integrated modeling framework, and what plausible curated set would be most sort of compatible with that. But the bottom line is, yeah, we don't know, and I had wondered about that during question times in other meetings.
Great, thanks, Helen.
I don't know,
Do you want to
Jim.
add some more, Stephanie?
Yeah, Jim, I don't know if you have more expertise than me, but from hearing what committee members have said, there's concern that when you downscale, you're taking information from the GCMs, the global climate models, and there's so much uncertainty in South Florida for those models that when downscaling, you're increasing the uncertainty. And so there's concern about the ability to get more accurate information given the uncertainty. And so the other approach is to find some estimated appropriate ranges that one can think based on the studies that have gone on that Helen's alluding to, but you can more of a statistical approach to bracket the ranges of uncertainty rather than to try to hope to downscale yourself into an answer given the wide range of uncertainty. I don't know, Jim, if you want to correct anything.
No, that's right.
Thank you, Stephanie. Our next question is one about, this is the 10th Everglades report, and each one is a different iteration. Stephanie, you've been doing these reports since they started. What would you say are some of the other differences? We talked earlier about some differences in terms of the climate change recommendations, but some of the other differences and points of progress between the previous biennial review and this one, and maybe even some of the ones before.
These reports are always fascinating because the committee gets to the finish line and they're exhausted and you think you've said all you can say, and then 6 months later there's all these exciting new topics, sometimes like one day later. I'm not sure there are differences as much as the program just continues to evolve, and so you realize that the more that gets done, there are different elements that need to be addressed. So in this one, adaptive management came up because, there are so many concurrent projects being planned, and each one has little challenges of things that aren't quite exactly as it was envisioned, whether it's in the planning stage, whether it's in the design stage or actually the operations after it was constructed, and then how it all fits together at a system scale. And so the more it moves forward, the more pressing that gets. I think the committee from the very earliest time kind of worried about how adaptive management would work, but now we're seeing it sort of work and seeing that there's a real value to it, but it's really challenging. But then we can grapple with entirely new issues like Indigenous knowledge that I think the committee hasn't given enough attention to in the past, and we could take a deeper dive. So those are just two examples, but others I know who have been on the project for a long time might weigh in.
Yes, I will do so. I would say one difference this time is there was a report available to us about the impact of the combined operational plan on the flow of water through the water conservation areas and into Everglades National Park, which showed a lot of information about responses of the system to the changes in the seasonal distribution of flow and geographic distribution of flow through the Central Everglades, which is, for the first time in a long, long time, much closer to what the historic distribution looked like. And we had a wealth of information about how the system was responding to that to look at. So a lot of results of restoration benefits to look at, and that ties into adaptive management. Now there's actual information about what's happening and gives those that are running the restoration a chance to look at what's actually happening and make adjustments. So that was actually pretty exciting to have that much information finally to look at.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, we've some of the issues that we've looked at in adaptive management is a good one in this report that are fairly new, are a reflection of restoration progress. We, 5 reports before, we didn't have to worry about much about restoration progress because we weren't moving more water through the system. And now, for example, across Tamiami Trail that we are. And so that's been largely beneficial, but it's also led to some effects that weren't fully anticipated, like increased phosphorus loading. And so we have to respond to that now. And it's a reflection of success in part, but it's new challenges arise from that. And so as a result of that, adaptive management is becoming more and more important.
Thanks, Jim. Our next question is, is kind of asking you all to really summarize this report in this moment. So what would you say your top level message to Congress about what they can do to help build on the progress described in this report?
I just kick it off with one short thing. Go, Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say one of the messages is just to convey that we're starting to see real significant progress in the last few years. And there's an area called the 8.5 square mile area, and flooding in that area has for decades prevented more water to be put in certain parts of the system, and they have solved that problem so that it's no longer a constraint, which is a huge step forward and opens up a lot of possibilities. So we are starting to see, and as someone who's been on the committee many times for many years, we're starting to see real things happening finally after years of planning. And that's, I think, an important message that things are really moving forward, and all the funding that's going into the restoration right now, that needs to continue to keep making progress at this speed.
Dave, do you have any thoughts on this?
I would just reiterate what Jeff has just said, because I think our message is continue to support the restoration program in the Everglades. But the second part, and we really hone in on this in the adaptive management chapter, is even though Congress said implement an adaptive management program in the original governance language under WRDA, it takes time to develop a culture to make it effective. And that culture includes not only the research, but getting people to trust each other, to work together, to share information, most importantly, to communicate. And I think that's what you're seeing the benefits of now, and we tried to capture in this report, is that culture has built, and it takes time. You look at any adaptive management program across the country, it takes time to mature. And that's what we're seeing now. And I would just encourage Congress to continue to support it, because now you're really starting to see results.
But as Dave also mentioned earlier, critical to that adaptive management program is a robust science enterprise. And there's work to be done there to continue to strengthen that. There is good science in the program, but there's, we still, Jeff mentioned the combined operational plan, COP, biennial report to documented progress. That's a non-CERP project. It was very thorough in terms of documentation, but in terms of CERP, sometimes it's more difficult to find how the progress on the ground is, well, like the natural system restoration progress is playing out. And to really, it's so important to Congress to know the benefits of their investments, and also to the adaptive management to see where things don't quite meet the objectives or the expectations given the implementation underway, so that things might be adapted a little bit to make it better. And so there's still work to be done in that front. And there are plenty of examples out there for the Everglades to look towards to better get that information out there.
That feels like a fantastic forward-looking note to end on. So thank you all for your time today. It looks like that's all the questions that we have time for from the audience. As a reminder, you can download the report at nap.edu. And a recording of this webinar will be up on the event page later next week. So enjoy your weekends and then take a look out for it next week. Again, I'd like to thank all of these panelists for joining us today, for your time today and all of your time working on the report and getting it out the door here. It's really exciting to see. And thank you to everybody who logged on to join us today. Thank you all again for joining us.